All right, so I want to start off with a question this morning. The question is this: how does it make you feel? How does it make you feel when somebody looks at you and says, "I do not trust you"? How does that make you feel? Especially if it's somebody that you really need to trust you or want to trust you. How does it make you feel? Now, I want you to hold on to that thought for a little bit. Today, we're starting a new series of conversations around a crisis that exists in our culture. Every fall, we ask our small groups to all go through the same study together. We actually ask them to partner with what we're doing as far as a series goes, so that at least one time a year, we're all on the same page and talking about the same thing. Now, preparing for this, to be honest with you, can be very daunting sometimes, because as I think about this every fall and think about this, I start trying to figure out, okay, what are we going to talk about? Because I want it to be something that is relevant to what we're going through, something that we're all kind of dealing with. And so, to be honest with you, as summer was coming along and my deadline was getting close to figuring this out, I just felt like I wasn't hearing from God. And so I'd been praying, and God, what is it that you want us to do? What should we be talking about? As summer kind of rolled around, I felt like I had a lot of good ideas, but nothing that was really a God idea. But then in August, I attended the Global Leadership Summit, which is a gathering every year of probably 10,000 or tens of thousands of people around the globe. And at this two-day event, we listen to a lot of different speakers from a lot of different professions. They might be pastors, they might be authors, they might be business people, they might be coaches who coach teams. But the hope is that as we hear from all these different people, that we can glean something that we can use from them and become better leaders. This year, as the first speaker took the stage, he said something like this, something that he often says. He says, so we're here so that we as leaders can get better. And then he says, because we all know that when a leader gets better, we all win. And that's kind of become the battle cry for the summit every year. But then he dropped this bomb. So he began his speech and he says, so as I begin to talk, he says, I got some bad news to tell you. I got something that I just really hate to tell you this, but the truth of the matter is nobody trusts you. Now, as he said that, I kind of pushed back a little bit, and I thought, well, that might be true of some of the people here, some business leaders and coaches or whatever, but people trust me. I'm a pastor, to which he must have been reading my mind, because he said, and this is true of every single one of you, even you who are pastors. And he might even said, especially you as pastors. And I thought, okay, well, that's interesting. But as I contemplated what he said, I thought, you know what? He's right. People don't trust me. And they don't just trust me, they don't trust pastors as a whole, but not just pastors. People are having a hard time trusting anybody these days. And unfortunately, maybe for good reasons. And so I got a couple more questions for you to think about, but here's a question. So how many of you will be honest enough to say with me that you have a hard time trusting somebody? There's somebody in your life that you just have a hard time trusting. Maybe it's an individual. Maybe it's an organization. Maybe it's a business of some sort. How many of you are finding it harder and harder these days to honestly trust people? I know that I have. Yeah, so even more hands went up that way. I kind of laughed earlier on this idea of trust. So we have these signals that we kind of give each other from time to time up here on stage when we're about to transition. And sometimes we're kind of mean to each other, but I was watching this transition take place between the opening song and the welcome and comments piece, where they transition from the song and Trey walks out into this. So sometimes we're not really sure when the song's going to end. And so we kind of rely on them to give us a nod, give us something. And so I watched Chad. He's up here playing. Now you'll be watching for this from now on, but he's too good. You'll never see it. But he looks at Trey and kind of gives him the signal, it's time. But Trey doesn't come out, because Trey's not trusting Chad, because Chad can't always be trusted, just to be honest with you. And so then I see him go, give him a real big nod. And then Trey walked out, and I had to laugh at that because, but that's just, we have fun with each other. So here's another question for you to think about. How many of you have ever experienced broken trust in your life? You trusted somebody and they broke that trust. That's probably true of every single one of us. We've all experienced that. Well, by nature, I am a very untrusting person. And if you don't believe me, just ask my wife. I always question people's motives. I always kind of express my distrust in people. And she'll say, well, you don't trust anybody. And I'm like, no, that's not true. I just don't trust people who give me a reason not to trust them. And she says, for you, that's everybody. And so I was like, well, okay. It took me a little while to own that and to admit it, but she is right. My first response usually is one of just questioning if this person is being truthful, if they're honest, or if they're the real deal or not. And this is true especially of like mechanics. Because we've all heard those stories of, you take your car to get it fixed and it needs something fixed that it really doesn't need to be fixed. And so I'm always skeptical of that. It's true of doctors, and I'll share stories throughout the series of kind of some of my crazy experiences with that. Repairmen who come to my house and I need them to fix something and they, when they tell me what it's going to cost and what all it needs, and I'm like, really, that can't be that bad. And so that's just always my first response when people tell me that. And maybe it comes from a lot of my past. I once worked for an exterminating company. In fact, I owned my own exterminating company for a little while, and I would get these calls. And people would say, hey, can you come and give me an estimate for X, Y, and Z? And so I'd visit their house. I'd crawl up under their house. I'd do an inspection for them. And I would come out and I would say, listen, I'm not sure why you thought you needed that work done, but there's just nothing wrong. And they're like, no, you don't understand. I've had somebody else who came out and they came out and said, hey, there's all this moisture damage underneath your house, and so you need a moisture barrier. Or they would say, hey, your house is infested with termites, and they would produce a little box with little bugs in it, and they would show the customer that. And I would crawl out from underneath the house, and I remember this one particular house, the crawl space to get underneath their house, you had to go in their house to actually get under their house. And so I came out, and I was just covered in dust. And the lady's like, I'm just worried. They told me I've got a moisture problem underneath my house. And I said, ma'am, does it look like, kind of did this and dust flew everywhere. But I quickly realized that you just can't trust people sometimes. And so maybe that's part of where that comes from. So let me go back to the summit. So as Greg Rochelle took the stage and said that, I began thinking about what he said over the next several days, to be honest with you. And as I thought about it, I began to feel like God was saying, this is what I want you to talk about this fall. This is these are the conversations that I want you to have, and I want you to create so that other people can have them, because there really is a crisis of trust. I think especially in our country that's growing. And especially, when we head into the political season that we're heading into, and we're going to have to vote for somebody in as a new president, and we hear all these stories, and it just gets, you don't know who to believe and who not to believe. One person, well, they did this, and then that person says, no, I never did that. And so you're just kind of left there. And I think just for a lot of different reasons over the last several years, that distrust has just really begun to grow. I think people are finding it. I know as I talk to people, I know where I find myself. And especially even as talking to people, are just finding it harder and harder and harder to trust people, to know who to trust, to know how to trust, to know when to trust, and all of those things. I know over the summer, Trey had shared with me a book that he was reading. In fact, it's this book by Dr. Henry Cloud called Trust. And it's a series, and this guy, Dr. Cloud, actually turned out to be one of the speakers at the summit this year. And when he spoke and kind of gave an overview of his book. And I was intrigued by what he said. And so I bought the book and began to read it. And I really found a lot of what he said to be very helpful. And so I'm going to use it kind of as the backdrop, if you will, for the conversations that we're going to have over the next several weeks. If you don't have a copy of this book, I'm not going to go word for word through it, but we're going to, like I said, use some big picture stuff in it to kind of paint some pictures. But we do have that book available, and if you want to get it, I highly recommend it. It's a great book. But here's what I'll do. I'm going to go ahead and show my cards, meaning I'm going to go ahead and show you the different things that we're going to talk about over the next several weeks. And so here's a list of those. Here's a list of those. There we go. So next week, we're going to talk about the 5 essentials of trust. Dr. Cloud paints this picture. He says if we're going to trust people, and if we're going to become people that people trust, these are 5 essentials that we must have. And so after we identify them, then we're going to apply them to our trust in God. I meet a lot of people, and Grace kind of mentioned, who find it very hard to trust God these days. And so there's a lot of questions about that. So we're going to take these 5 essentials and look and see if we can trust God. We're going to talk about trusting the church. There's a lot of distrust with people when it comes to the church. We're going to talk about trusting others. We're going to talk about trusting yourself. I don't know about you, but there are times where I don't trust myself to be able to do something. Anybody else struggle with that, kind of trusting yourself? Yeah. So we're going to talk about that. And then we're going to wrap the series up by talking about when trust gets broken. So what happens? What do we do? How do we respond when trust gets broken in our lives? And then the very last week, we're going to talk about restoring trust and talk about what that looks like and how we can get to that. So I'm really looking forward to these different conversations with you. Today, excuse me, as an introduction to this series, I want to talk to you about the importance of trust. In fact, it's so important that I don't know if you've thought about it. I hadn't thought about it to this degree, but everything in life truly does depend on trust. Now, we went through a series over the summer called Love, and we talked about the enduring power of love, and I thought it was an incredible series. I really enjoyed it. I loved us digging deeper into what love was, and without a doubt, love is definitely a top ingredient that we must have in our lives to enjoy life to the fullest. But trust may trump love, to be honest with you. Because if we don't have trust, it's almost going to be impossible to experience and show and love others and even have others to love us. I like what Dr. Cloud puts, or the way he puts it in his book. Here's what he says. He says, trust is the fuel for all of life. Trust is the fuel for all of life. Nothing in life works without it, especially relationships. He says we are wired biologically, neurologically, emotionally, spiritually, and psychologically to trust. Trust is the currency that drives everything. Trust is the currency that drives everything. So again, me being the untrusting person that I am, I kind of pushed back on this as I began reading his book. And I thought, okay, I get it, but it's not that big of a deal. But I was kind of like the guy that there's a story that he tells in the beginning of the book. One day, Dr. Cloud is flying, and he's actually working on the research, putting it together to write this book. And there's a gentleman sitting beside him who asks, what do you do for a living? And Dr. Cloud tells him, and he says, well, what are you working on? And so he tells him he's, talking about trust, and the guy immediately said, well, listen, he said, you're kind of wasting your time because I don't trust anybody. To which Dr. Cloud was like, really, you don't trust anybody? And the man was like, no, trust only leads to trouble. And he says, people only get, he said, just people are untrustworthy. And you only get hurt when you trust people. To which Dr. Cloud responded to him and said, well, I hate to break this news to you, but you're much more trusting than you realize. And the guy again kind of pushes back, and Dr. Cloud says, well, let me just point out a couple things that you're trusting right now. He says, you're trusting the pilot of this airplane who you've never met to get you from one place to the other. He says you're trusting the man or woman who fueled this airplane before it left the ground, that they put pure fuel in there, the right fuel that needed to be in there. He says you're trusting you ate a sandwich earlier. He says you're trusting the person who made that sandwich, that he inspected the meat and that it didn't have E. coli in it. He says you're trusting the serviceman who, checked out the compression system on this airplane so that you and I could breathe the oxygen that we're breathing right now at 30,000 feet. And as I read that story, I really began to pay attention to my own life because, like I said, by nature, I'm usually not very trusting. And I realized that on a day-to-day basis, I'm much more trusting than I realize. For example, every day that I get in a car, and I always think about this driving from home to here, I'm trusting that that person who's coming at me from the other direction is going to stay on their side of the road. Now, every day that trust gets broken a little bit more because they seem to hug that yellow line even more and more, but I'm trusting that that's going to happen. Almost every week, I write a message. I spend time studying and putting things together and thoughts together and write a message. And every week, I show up here trusting that somebody's going to come and listen to what I have to say. Trust is just a part of our everyday life. I trust that the people who put my truck together were having a good day when they assembled it, especially when I'm driving down the interstate at a high rate of speed. Now, that's pretty easy for me because I happen to drive a Ram truck. Now, some of you who drive Chevys, you probably don't have that great of a confidence, and I get that, but that's okay. But seriously, trust is just a part of who we are. This week, I was reminded we had some HVAC systems replaced in this big room. And when I came into work one day this week, here's what I saw. This big crane sitting out there. And as I rounded the corner, I'd been thinking about this message and thing we were talking about, and I just thought, there's a whole lot of trust going on right there. And coming out of a background of construction, I know, somebody's trusting the crane operator, somebody's trusting the chain, the straps. There's just all kinds of trust going on that they have to depend and trust on each other because in a lot of ways their lives really do depend on it. And now I'm trusting that you are going to help pay for those HVAC systems. Just to put all my cards on the table. I'll tell you how much the two big units that run this room, and I can tell a big difference this morning because they've been going bad for a while, and the humidity, it was hard to get some of the moisture out of here. So this morning, to me, it feels really good in here. But to the tune of a little over $200,000. That's what it costs just to replace 2 of the 4 units that are on this room. So I'm trusting you to partner with me to help pay for those. So I'm just putting all my cards out there. Dr. Cloud says this: trust is the fuel for life. Nothing in life works without it. And I think we get that. I think when we stop and think about it, it takes trust to make life work. It really does. If we don't trust, then everything just kind of falls apart, doesn't it? I mean, if there's no trust, what kind of life do we have? What kind of life can we live if we don't have trust and learn to trust? But let's be honest, we have all experienced the devastating pain that comes along when trust gets broken. We've been on the other side of that. We've trusted people, and we've seen that trust get broken. I was thinking about this. In almost every way that I could think that we trust gets broken. There are times when that car that's coming at you does cross the line. I remember in elementary school one morning, I was on the bus, probably 7 or 8 seats back from the very front of the bus, and we came around a turn, and a dump truck had crossed the line, was in our lane, and we hit head on with that dump truck. And luckily nobody was killed, but there were some people who were very seriously injured and would be injured, would pay with their lives for the rest of their lives. And so sometimes that does happen. The crane, we've seen stories where booms on the crane break, straps break, cords break, loads get dropped where people were trusting that those things would hold up. There are times when even as awesome as my Ram truck really is, it does break down and leave me stranded on the side of the road. We've all experienced that. But more importantly, the spouse who makes a commitment to us till death do us part, but decides to leave way earlier than that. The business partner who steals from us. The pastor who doesn't always live what he's preaching. Best friends betray us, and the list could go on and on. But the more this happens, the more trust erodes in our lives. And the more that we see what's going on in our world, there's no wonder that all of us are finding it harder and harder. We're living life a little more guarded maybe than ever before. We're having a hard time dropping that guard and trusting people in the past who we thought we could trust. We're just not sure anymore. And more every day that trust erodes. But I'm here to say that there is good news. We can trust, and we can turn this around. We can be wiser in who we trust and the way we trust, and we can create better trust for others. In other words, you and I can become people who people can trust. You and I can become, better at creating that. We can turn this thing around. I agree with Dr. Cloud when he says that we were wired this way because we are wired to trust. And I don't know, I'd never thought about it this way until I read his book, and I read that thought. It's like we are wired to trust. And I thought, well, what does the Bible really say about that? And as I dug just, barely into the Bible as I started, it's like we really are. I think of King David. King David, who wrote parts, especially the Old Testament, a lot of our Psalms, he kind of wrote songs and poems, often expressing the way he was feeling. But King David knew what it was like to not be able to trust people. He knew that he couldn't trust King Saul, the guy that was there before him. He found that there were times where he couldn't trust his own son. His son turned against him and eventually took the throne away from him. David found that he couldn't trust himself at times, that he knew that even he was, had the chance to make mistakes. He writes about his questioning God's faithfulness at times. And so he understood how hard it could be to trust at times. But he also knew that this was the way that we were all created. Here's what he says in Psalms 22:9. He says, speaking to God, he says, God, you brought me out of the womb. You made me trust in you. You made me trust in you, even at my mother's breast. David understood that it was just the way he was wired. Even when it was hard to do, he understood that it was within him. He was built this way. He was wired this way to trust not only God, but to trust others and even trust himself. Again, when he knew how hard that could be, he knew and understood that life depends on trust. We cannot experience life to its fullest unless we learn to trust. Without trust, people have experienced some awful side effects from that. We've been there. We know what it's like when we get hurt and we're like, I'm never trusting anybody again. And we've said that. I'm never dropping my guard. I'll never go there again. I'll never enter a relationship like that again. I'm never going to allow myself to experience that kind of brokenness and that trust again in my life. And when we do that and we begin to isolate ourselves, it's a horrible place to have to live. And so we can move past that. Stephen Covey, in a book that he wrote on trust, it's a little bit older than Dr. Cloud's, but this one is called The Speed of Trust. He says the one thing that changes everything. But in this, he talks about how much faster than we realize that trust can actually be restored. I want to read you just a short section out of this. It's at the very beginning of his book. And again, it's titled The One Thing That Changes Everything. But listen to what he says. I just think he captures what I think many of us know and are feeling. He says there's one thing that is common to every individual, every relationship, every team, every family, every organization, every nation, every economy, and civilization throughout the world. One thing which, if removed, will destroy the most powerful government, the most successful business, the most thriving economy, the most influential leadership, the greatest friendship, the strongest character, the deepest love. But he says, on the other hand, if we develop and leverage that one thing, has the potential to create unparalleled success and prosperity in every dimension of life. Yet it is the least understood, most neglected, most underestimated possibly of our time. That one thing, he says, is trust. Trust impacts us 24/7, 365 days a year. It undergirds and affects the quality of every relationship, every communication, every work project, every business venture, every effort in which we are engaged. It changes the quality of every present moment and alters the trajectory and outcome of every future moment of our lives, both personally and professionally. He says, contrary to what most people believe, trust is not soft, elusive, some soft, elusive quality that you either have or don't have. Rather, trust is a pragmatic, tangible, actionable asset that you can create much faster than you probably think possible. While corporate scandals, terrorist threats, office politics, and broken relationships have created low trust on almost every front, he says, I contend that the ability to establish, grow, extend, and restore trust is not only vital to our personal and interpersonal well-being, it is the key leadership competency of the new global economy. He says, I'm also convinced that in every situation, nothing is as fast as the speed of trust. And contrary to popular belief, trust is something that you can do something about. In fact, he says, you can get good at creating it. And honestly, that's what I hope comes out of our time together over these next several weeks. I hope that you believe that we can do something about it. I believe that, especially as followers of Christ, we can turn this crisis around that exists in our country. We can become people that people trust, especially as followers of Christ. If people ought to be able to trust anybody, it should be us, because we trust the most trusting person ever, and that is God. And the reason he's the most trusting is because he's never failed us, and he never will fail us. And so I look forward over the next couple of weeks as we walk through this. And so if you would like to get better at trusting as well as being trusted, then I hope that you'll join me for these conversations. And I really want to encourage you to do this, and it's not too late to do that, and Trey mentioned this earlier, to get into a small group, because all of our small groups are going to be taking a lot of what we talk about on Sunday morning and diving a little bit deeper in that. And here's the other thing that might just happen if you get in a small group, especially if you're an untrusting person. You'll probably find a group of people that you can trust more than you realize. And so I hope that you'll take advantage of that. And like Trey said, it's not too late to get in one of those groups. Today, as we wrap this up, I'm going to give you 3 questions that I want you to be thinking about. Now, if you're in a small group, you're going to see these questions and a few others that are similar to it. But if you're not in a group and maybe you're going to lunch today, maybe you'll take some time and just think through these or talk about them with somebody else. But here are the 3 questions I'd like for you to be thinking about. Where do you see evidence in your community that trust is a necessary part of human life? I know as I stopped and started thinking about this, I realized that trust is a big part of that. And there are benefits to trusting. So take some time and just pay attention to that. I want you to list 3 people whom you actively trust. And then take each one of them and just make a short list maybe. Why do I trust this person? Because there are people in your life that you trust. And maybe you haven't even thought about why you trust them, but take some time and do that, because it'll help you understand this conversation that we're going to have over the next couple of weeks. And then the last question is this: what are some of the main ways you have benefited from trusting others in recent years? What are some of the ways that you have benefited from trusting others in recent years? So I hope that you'll join me for this journey together. I look forward to what God's going to do in all of our lives. I'm going to ask you to stand with me, and I'm going to close this in prayer today. Father, there's no doubt that there's a crisis in our culture when it comes to trust. Lord, trust has been broken so much. Lord, we've been told so many things that just are not true. Lord, it's getting harder and harder for us to know what's true and what's not true when people tell us stuff. God, I know what it's like when somebody looks at me and says, I don't trust you. And I think we've all felt that. God, we've all felt the pain that goes along when trust gets broken in our own lives with other people and organizations, doctors, whatever it might be. And God, it makes it harder to trust again. But Father, we know that you wired us this way. You created us to trust. Lord, we can't help but do that. Lord, life really does depend on this one thing, trust. The quality of life depends on it. And so, God, I'm praying that you will teach us, Lord, how to know how to trust, know when to trust, know who to trust. And God, more importantly, that you would make all of us more trusting people. God, people that others can look to and have trust in what we say and what we do. And so, God, I just pray, Lord, I believe that you put this on my heart for a reason. And so, God, I pray that you just help all of us over these next couple of weeks just to hear what you have to say to us. And God, may your church be the change agent in our culture when it comes to trust. And I pray and ask this in Christ's name. And we all agreed together and said, amen. God bless you guys. We'll see you next week.